Hey everyone, this is our Sunday Bible study for January 3rd, 2021. I realize that this is being posted a little after the 3rd. The reason being is we're trying to play catch up after I had missed a Sunday due to the coronavirus. And so last Sunday on the 3rd, we released the video for the 27th. Now we're releasing the video for the 3rd. And that will put us back on track for this coming Sunday on the 10th. We'll be back lined up with where we should be in the classroom book. Obviously, I could have just skipped the 27th lesson and not worried about it, but I really didn't want to skip a lesson in the book. And so this was the best way I could come up with to try to quickly play catch up and get us back on track. And so you can just count this as a bonus lesson since we missed one earlier. And I'm glad to be able to be back, glad for us to be back studying God's Word together. And I hope that this is another lesson that is beneficial to you. We're in Lesson 5 in the classroom book. We're looking at the foundations material from the Gospel Advocate. And we've been studying in the book of Genesis. This is the second part of a two-part series that we've been in the book of Genesis. And we are in Lesson 5 looking at Jacob and Esau. So look at Jacob and Esau. We're going to notice a couple of passages from two different chapters. First, from chapter 25, we're going to look at verses 24 through 34 together. And then in chapter 27, we'll notice verses 1 through 13. So we're going to see with Jacob and Esau. Jacob and Esau did not have the easiest relationship. There's a lot of tension between the two of them. And as we'll see as we go through the text, some of that tension is brought about because of the types of individuals that they are. Some of it is brought about because of some scheming and some rash decisions. Some of it is brought about because of the favoritism of their parents. And so a lot of things are at play here as we look at these two individuals. Of course, Jacob and Esau are going to be the children of Isaac and Rebekah. We notice the marriage of Isaac and Rebekah in our last lesson, and so we're now going to be noticing the children that are born to them in this lesson. The author of the book begins the introduction saying, although Isaac did not start his family as late in life as Abraham, he was 40 years old when he took Rebekah as wife. Under normal circumstances, this would not pose an obstacle to having children. The problem, however, was that Rebekah, like Isaac's own mother Sarah, was barren. Verse 21. As was true before Isaac's birth, the reader of Genesis is left to wonder how God will fulfill his promise to bless all nations through Abraham's seed. Well, as we think about this, as we look at this, Sarah's barrenness was not an obstacle to God and him fulfilling the promise that he had made to Abraham. And so we should not think that Rebekah's barrenness is going to be a problem to God in making sure that he's able to continue this promise now through Isaac. Thankfully, resolution, the author says, comes swiftly. For Isaac pleaded with the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his plea, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. The brevity of Genesis 25 makes it seem as if the pregnancy began shortly after Isaac and Rebekah married. In reality, it did not occur until 20 years later, verse 26. And so, once again, we see a time frame. And, the Bible says that Isaac pleaded with the Lord and that the Lord granted his plea. It would seem, though, that, once again, God's done that in his own time. I find it hard to believe that once it was discovered that Rebekah was barren, that Isaac did not begin at that point to plead to God. But as we see, it was 20 years later before Rebekah is able to conceive. And so it's a reminder to us, as we've seen thus far throughout the book of Genesis, God's timetable is not always ours. God works things out, but he does that according to his timetable. As we continue on, the author says Rebekah's pregnancy was unusual. Rather than carrying one child, she carried two. Because she did not understand why the children struggled together within her, verse 22 of Genesis 25, she asked the Lord about the matter. In the response, the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb. 2 people shall be separated from your body. One people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. And so God has, if you will, made a statement about how this is all going to take place. Whether Rebekah fully understood the Lord's explanation, she gave birth to twin sons. Prior to this point, Scripture records no other instance of twins. Thus, a new problem arose. Who would receive the birthright? Describing the situation, Curavella wrote, and so the fighting begins. A struggle to be the firstborn. A drive to obtain the blessing of God as the participants slug it out between themselves to be the first in line for divine blessing, as if they could overcome sovereign design by human vigor. And so Curavella talks about the fact that they're thinking that somehow what they're going to do is going to change what God's going to do. Well, God's going to work it out the way that God chooses to, whether we agree with that or whether we go along with it. The firstborn son was named Esau. The younger son was named Jacob. Sadly, the strife present in Rebekah's womb remained with Jacob and Esau throughout much of their lives. This was not helped when Jacob, whose name means hill grabber, convinced Esau to sell the birthright for bread and stew of lentils. Neither was it eased when Rebekah helped Jacob scheme and lie to Isaac to steal a special blessing he intended to give Esau. Nevertheless, Jacob was the one through whom God intended to fulfill his promise to Abraham. And he has been throughout the book of Genesis. As he has been throughout the book of Genesis, God is in control. As Brueggemann noted, this grandson of the promise is a rascal compared to his faithful grandfather Abraham or his successful father Isaac. God has chosen and destined this man Jacob in a special way. The initial designation of Jacob is inscrutable. We are not told why God wills this inversion of natural right, but as the narrative is given to us, it is this designation by God which brings Jacob to well-being and prosperity. The story of Jacob and Esau is one of rivalry and strife. At the same time, it is part of the greater story of the people who will be called by Jacob's other name, Israel. And so that brings us now to our text. Beginning in verse 24, we're in Genesis chapter 25. So when her days were fulfilled for her to give birth, indeed there were twins in her womb. And the first came out red. He was like a hairy garment all over, so they called his name Esau. Afterward his brother came out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. On page 50 in our classroom book, the Longman observed baby Jacob was grabbing baby Esau's heel as he followed him out of the womb, as if he was trying to pull him back in and take precedence. The name Jacob has a further idiomatic meaning of he deceives. One meaning of Jacob is a supplanter. In other words, someone who's trying to take from another. But we see another meaning of his name also is he deceives. While it is doubtful that the meaning was intended by the parents, as the story goes on, we'll see that it aptly fits Jacob's character. And so we have Jacob and Esau born. What do we learn about them? And so the boys grew, and Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a mild man, dwelling in tents. And the biblical record, the author says, also reveals Esau was impulsive and vindictive, focused primarily upon the moment. Conversely, Jacob was a schemer who positioned himself for further success. Whatever rivalry existed between Jacob and Esau was amplified by parental favoritism. As we see in verse 28, and Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Here we see the danger of playing favorites. And you know, it's interesting. You would think, and we'll see this as we continue, I'm sure, in the book of Genesis, but you would think after Jacob witnessed all the destruction and problems that resulted because of the favoritism of his parents, that Jacob would say, hey, I'm not going to play favorites with my children. But what do we see happen? Jacob does the exact same thing. And what happens? Destruction as a result of it. It's important as parents that, yes, we love our children and we should strive to love them equally. Each child's going to have some things about them that are going to be like us. Each child's going to have some things that are not like us. But we need to make sure that we strive to love each one in an equal way, not to play favorites. As we'll see with Jacob and Esau, we see it with Joseph and his brothers. That never turns out well for those individuals. On page 51 in the book, the author brings out a great point. He's quoting from a man by the name of Selhammer. Selhammer believed the struggle between Jacob and Esau was indicative of a broader theme that flowed throughout Genesis, and that is the struggle between brothers. Other examples of this include Cain and Abel in chapter 4, Ishmael and Isaac, as we've already seen in chapter 21, and the sons of Jacob, which we will see later, chapter 37. Nevertheless, he wrote, out of each of the struggles, God's will was accomplished. The point is not so much that the struggles were necessary for the accomplishment of the will of God, but rather that God's will was accomplished in spite of the conflict. As we're going to notice, the way that things turn about between Jacob and Esau is through a lot of lying and scheming. That doesn't mean that God condoned the lying and scheming. God would have brought it to pass without the lying and the scheming. Okay? God would have made it to where Jacob would have been the one who received the blessing, who received the birthright. He was the one that was going to be through whom the promise was going to be fulfilled. And so God would have made that happen. He did not need the lying and the scheming to take place. And that's the point that Selhammer's making here throughout all of these different instances where we see this conflict. God's will was accomplished in spite of the conflict. It wasn't that God needed the conflict in order to accomplish his will. He accomplished his will in spite of it being there. Isaac and Ishmael, God didn't need any help there. If Sarah would not have given her handmaid to Abraham, if Abraham would have not accepted her handmaid, Hagar, then Ishmael would have never been born, and it never would have been a problem because God's will would have still been accomplished in Sarah giving birth to Isaac. And the same is true here with Jacob and Esau. If Jacob had not stolen the birthright, if Rebekah and Jacob had not schemed together to steal the blessing, God still would have made it to where Jacob received those things. His will was accomplished despite their interference. That brings us now to verses 29 through 34. The author of our book lays out the first two sections as twins born in verses 24 through 28, and then twins clash in verses 29 through 34. Now Jacob, verse 29, cooked a stew, and Esau came in from the field, and he was weary. And Esau said to Jacob, please feed me with the same red stew, for I am weary. Therefore his name was called Edom. But Jacob said, sell me your birthright as of this day. On pages 51 and 52, the author says, Jacob obviously knew the impulsive tendencies of his brother well. For when Esau requested to eat some of the stew, Jacob offered to comply only if Esau gave up his birthright in exchange. Given the importance of the birthright, Jacob's demand should have ended their negotiations. It was too high a price to pay. The firstborn was entitled to a double portion of the inheritance. He also assumed a place of prominence in the family. That Esau so easily gave up his birthright is shocking. He thought only about the moment. You look at this, the birthright with Jacob and Esau, if they were the only two children, then the inheritance would have been divided up into thirds. Why thirds? Well, because Esau, who was the firstborn, he would have received 2/3 of the inheritance. And Jacob, he would have received 1/3. So say you have $60 as the inheritance. And I know the inheritance would have been way more than that, but just simple math. Well, then with $60, Esau would have received 40 and Jacob 20. Now that's how that would have been divided. So this birthright is a very important thing. But we see Esau, his impulsive nature, his only thinking about the moment, he's going to give that up. And Esau said, look, I'm about to die, which And the first time I read that, I was like, dramatic much, okay? He's not about to die. He's not, yes, he's weary, he's hungry, but there's no doubt that there was food within the house. He had not gone weeks without eating here. And he says, I'm about to die, so what is this birthright to me? Then Jacob said, swear to me as of this day. So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. And Jacob gave Esau bread and stew of lentils. Then he ate and drank, arose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. The author of the book says that Ross summarized the event. Esau was oblivious to what he had because he was preoccupied with the way he was. Jacob was occupied with obtaining what Esau had and planned to capitalize on the way Esau was. The last part of the narrative report, with its rapid succession of verbs, and he ate and drank and arose and went out, provides a climax to the description of profane Esau. The section ends by declaring, thus Esau despised his birthright. This does not mean that he hated the blessing he was in line to receive. It means he failed to appreciate and protect it. Interestingly, the New Testament likens the sin of fornication to the behavior of Esau when he sold his birthright. Those who give up their virginity before marriage or break their marriage vows for one moment of sexual gratification behave like Esau. So in Esau, we see someone who's only worried about the now. He's only worried about the moment. He is only worried about what's going on right then. And as a result of that attitude, he gives up something that was very important, something that was very precious. And we need to make sure that we don't focus on the temporary and grab hold of the temporary at the cost of the eternal. The Bible talks a lot about looking past those things that are temporary. Paul talks about it, in fact, looking past those things that are temporary to those things which are eternal. That's how Paul was able to remain faithful. He looked past the temporary problems that he was facing to what was eternal that awaited him. And you see, we can give up eternity for just some temporary things now. And when we do that, we behave just like Esau did. We look at Esau's behavior and we're like, he's being dumb. I mean, he's giving up his birthright. He's giving up the right to inherit 2/3 of everything, to inherit only 1/3, all because he wants something to eat right then. We look at that and we say, that's dumb. But friends, it's just as dumb for us to give in to sin now for moments of pleasure. The Bible talks about, I'm not telling you anything that you don't know. Sin is pleasurable. If there was no pleasure attached to sin, then we wouldn't want to do it. That's the allure of it. But it's temporary. The Hebrew writer refers to it as the passing pleasure of sin. So it's temporary. It's not going to last. And once it's done, well then, friends, it's over. But eternity, that's what hangs in the balance. So let's not be like Esau. Let's make sure that we keep things in perspective. That brings us to the final section, chapter 27, verses 1 through 13. In verse 1, now it came to pass when Isaac was old, and his eyes were so dim that he could not see, that he called Esau his older son, and said to him, my son. And he answered him, here I am. Then he said, behold, now I am old, I do not know the day of my death. Now therefore please take your weapons, your quiver and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me. And make me savory food such as I love, and bring it to me that I may eat, that my soul may bless you before I die. The author says the text does not say why it was necessary for Esau to prepare Isaac a meal before he could be blessed. But it did indicate this was the reason Isaac favored Esau over Jacob. Steinman supposed Isaac's actions on this occasion to be similar to those of Esau when he sold his birthright. He wrote Isaac's desires ran counter both to the prophecy given to Rebekah and to the bitterness that Esau had brought into his life. Clearly, Isaac's appetite overruled his better judgment, as he intended to act counter to God's revealed will. I hadn't even really thought about it from that standpoint until I read through that and meditated on it a little bit more, that Isaac is acting in that same impulsive nature that we see in Esau. Maybe that's where it came from. Maybe Esau learned it from Isaac. But we see here that God had pretty well made it clear who was to be the one who would be blessed, who was the one through which everything was going to flow, and the one that would be the one in charge, that the older would serve the younger. But we see Isaac here appears to be going against that. Of course, as we are going to see, Rebekah's not going to allow that to happen. Now Rebekah was listening when Isaac spoke to Esau his son. And Esau went into the field to hunt game and bring it. So Rebekah spoke to Jacob her son, saying, Indeed, I heard your father speak to Esau your brother, saying, Bring me game and make savory food for me, that I may eat it and bless you in the presence of the Lord before my death. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice according to what I command you. Go now to the flock, and bring me from there 2 choice kids of the goats, and I will make savory food from them for your father, such as he loves. Then you shall take it to your father, that he may eat it, and that he may bless you before his death. And Jacob said to Rebekah his mother, Look, Esau my brother is a hairy man, and I am a smooth-skinned man. Perhaps my father will feel me, and I shall seem to be a deceiver to him, and I shall bring a curse on myself and not a blessing. But his mother said to him, Let your curse be on me, my son. Only obey my voice and go, get them for me. As you continue on in the text of chapter 27, Jacob goes along with the plan of Rebekah. They take the hide of the goat and place it on his arms so that his arms feel hairy. He puts on a coat of Esau so that he smells like Esau. While Isaac does say that, the smell and the feel is Esau, but the voice is Jacob's, Isaac ends up blessing Jacob. Of course, Esau comes in, brings the savory food to him, and Isaac's like, wait a minute, who was in here that I've just blessed then? And so Esau recognizes that it was Jacob who already had his birthright and who now, through deception, stole his blessing. And as you come to the verse 41, as you approach the end of chapter 21, so Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father blessed him. And Esau said in his heart, The days of mourning for my father are at hand. Then I will kill my brother Jacob. Now, Rebekah hears of this, learns of Esau's plan to kill him. And so Rebekah convinces Isaac under the ruse of finding Jacob a wife that's not one of the Canaanites, as Esau had already done. In fact, Esau had married a couple of, when it's all said and done, he's married a couple of Canaanite women that have been a thorn in the side of Isaac and Rebekah. And so he convinces Isaac to send Jacob away to find a wife from among their people. And so Jacob is going to flee. And that brings you to chapter 28 and everything that takes place there is Jacob makes this attempt to get away from Esau. That brings us to the applications. 2 that the author gives us. Number 1, Esau's impulsive behavior stands as an example to avoid. Rather than living only for the moment, as he was when he thoughtlessly sold his birthright, we must think soberly about the consequences of our behavior. Individuals who cavalierly yield to temptation mirror the behavior of Esau. Those who wish to please God instead must seek the way of escape. And so, as we talked about earlier, we need to learn from Esau and not trade what is eternal for that is what is temporary. The second application, he says, God's ability to accomplish his will despite the obvious flaws in the family of Abraham is encouraging. Neither favoritism, jealousy, schemes, or lies could thwart his intentions. We should rejoice that he is able to use imperfect people to accomplish his perfect plan. Truly, the Most High rules in the kingdoms of men. Daniel 4:32. Indeed, what a great blessing it is to know that God can use us. And despite the fact that we are flawed, imperfect beings, he can use us, though, to accomplish his grand will. We learn a lot from Jacob and Esau. We learn a lot from their mistakes and the need to avoid them ourselves. That brings us to Lesson 6, which is where we will pick up on Sunday. Lesson 6, we're going to notice Jacob at Bethel again. We're going to skip forward now to Genesis chapter 35, and we're going to notice verses 1 through 13 together. I want to thank you for taking the time to watch this. I hope that there's been some things that you've learned from it. I know that I learned as I went through and studied it so that I could make the video. I hope that it's been a blessing to you. Remember, friends, stay healthy, stay hopeful, stay holy, and I hope you have a great day.